Right. So first of all, militarism stalls. So you will have a decline in the recourse to military operations, particularly offensive military operations, than you've had in the past. I think you will have authority tested and questioned. Occasionally, that will redouble authority, and authority figures will be strengthened, but generally they will be questioned and weakened and need to search for legitimacy. Three, fake news and superstition propagating more than before, and also the means by which people feel confident in their views will be shaken. So interestingly, at this time, it's arrived at the same time we're, if you like, coming to terms with the way social media has been difficult in the last few years. So we've had quite an interesting response from the social media giants into how COVID has been dealt with. And so that's actually been quite interesting. The questions earlier about will science be regarded in a higher light than before, it'll be interesting seeing how that turns out. But again, some of the people who've been prognosticating about this, the libertarians, the anti-mask people, haven't really changed their views, so it's not clear how much that will go. Xenophobia and the them and us society, and whether that's like to increase, I think that has been borne out by and large. And I suspect that might be a resounding longer-term trend that comes from this. I suspect people, even when COVID's gone, people will still be hesitant and worried and more fearful about germs from the other. So I think this is a deep intrinsic human characteristic which we've had for many years, and I suspect it's been opened up and suppressed, if you like, by modern times. But I think it's recurring because of COVID, and I think it'll stay with us for a time after COVID is gone. Winners and losers. The prediction was right that there would be new winners and losers, but I was wrong as to who they would be. So previous pandemics had generally affected rich people more and lowered their wealth. This has affected poor people more. So it's actually exacerbated inequalities in wealth and income. And the key reason there is because the impact has really been on income rather than wealth. Will that persist? I think it probably will. I think when people go back to work, it's hard to replace consumer-facing industries. So I think the hospitality industry, as soon as it can, a year, 2 years from now, most of the developed world will be back to more or less where it was, albeit with a greater churn. Many restaurants will have shut down, but new ones will open in their place. So, and I think also people will relish the idea of coming back to be social. A key lesson here is the Roaring Twenties in the US, where after the devastating Spanish flu, people were very keen to socialize and spend money and celebrate and party and so on. And we may well find that we have quite a bit of that going on. Some groups suffer more. That's definitely happened this time. And as I mentioned earlier, I think it could lead to a popular movement to have a more socialized health system, stronger public measures, or maybe, and it could be done on a legal or a rights-based system rather than a mechanical public supply-based system. It may also be that you have to have it happen again, tragically, before that lesson is learned. We'll have to see, but it could be that some lessons need to be learned multiple times before they're actually enacted upon. An example here is gun violence in the US. So every time there's a mass shooting and a mass tragedy with 20 people killed in a gun incident, you imagine there might be a political response, and it tends not to happen for whatever reason. I suspect it might be that we have to have a second health emergency before we really have the political will to make it happen. But maybe it'll happen sooner than that. We'll have to see. And then the last one was the new culture. So some of this is already starting to happen. People have spent their time, making sourdough bread or watching Netflix or reading books. I suspect lots of people will have invested in art projects themselves during this time. That may well result in a glut, an excess supply of those artistic products, based not least upon the fact that they will be of mixed quality. We were discussing yesterday how there was a surplus of books about Afghanistan in the years after the sort of 10 years ago, 8 years ago, when lots of people went to Afghanistan and came back and wrote books, and those books were of mixed quality. I suspect we may well find we have something here, but give it 5 or 10 years. People want to get over the idea of the lockdowns, of the COVID, of the dying, but then they'll come back and they'll reflect on it 5 or 10 years later once they've had a new phase of life. And I think then we will have a new sort of culture emerging. And that won't just be in the form of fiction and books and art and cinema. It will also be in the form of architecture, I would suspect, and airport design, where you have a quarantine zone, or you have buildings which don't require aircon or better ventilated, or all these sorts of things. And again, the thing about the architecture and so forth, it will be very much COVID focused. So it may or may not be appropriate for the next pandemic that comes through, depending on whether it's how much like COVID it is. So there you go. There's my sort of seven guesses for the future.